Hola, Guatemala. What a pleasure to be here and see so many old friends and many new friends in the audience. And kudos to Volcano. It's really exciting to follow two powerful women. Let's just acknowledge that bit of programming. Today, I want to talk to you about innovation portals. And what I mean by innovation portals are efforts by regions and nations to develop specific expertise in technologies. Now, this can take many forms. My focus today is about what happens when you align key sectors, such as climate aligning with space. Climate change is all around us, and space exploration and commercialization is quickly moving from fantasy to industry. The real question is, how will we choose to participate? Will we be victims, bystanders, or perhaps the drivers of these changes and the beneficiaries? I'd like you to join me on a small thought experiment for these few minutes I have with you. And that is to, for just today, put climate change as an existential threat over here. It absolutely is those things. But I would argue it's also a massive market opportunity. What happens, what changes in your strategies when you take a minute to look at climate that way? Slide. Whose vision of the future do we want? We get the future that we invest in. Too often, we all let the future happen by default. I'm guilty of it too. We blame it on politics, corruption, or a common one, not enough access to capital. I'm not here to be a Pollyanna and say these are not real and powerful, challenging forces. But I will say that things don't need to be anywhere near close to perfect for you to change the center of gravity in your industry or in your region and therefore the world. I especially wanted to come to Volcano because it's precisely countries like Guatemala with young populations who I believe are going to lead the future, if they choose to. Frankly, if they grab it. Let's see about the clicker. No. There we go. Space is big, and I think it's really cool. It's dramatic. But it's also our ultimate frame of reference. Before there were rockets or rovers or even telescopes, space, the heavens, helped shape our sense of who we are in the universe. After all, many nations are nowhere near the sea, but every country can look up at the sky. Will we take any better care of space and our atmosphere than we have of the oceans? Well, the signs are not great. We're already polluting, we're already land grabbing, and we're already even saber rattling in space. Is this really the future that we want? Oops. I want to talk about the next 30 years and the crossroads we're at right now. We have many choices, opportunities, and challenges. I'm going to start by putting to bed the tired Earth versus space zero-sum game. I think that's the ultimate isolationism. It doesn't serve anyone. It certainly doesn't serve Earth. There's a wonderful saying in improv, yes, and. And I truly believe that's the superpower of humans, to adapt and together to do big, bold things. Remember, we get the future we invest in. Space. Or more precisely, what I like to call near space. This little smidgen of space in a small galaxy in a very big universe. This is where all the action is going to be for us in the next 30 years. It's becoming painfully obvious that our planet is reaching a breaking point in terms of climate. But it's also true that these decades will set the tone and the rules for humans as a starfaring species for perhaps the next 1,000 years. From a distance, sometimes it's easier to look at systems and see the patterns and learn from them, including looking at how humans choose to govern themselves and form cultures. Here are 5 systems that are forecast to exponentially change in the next 30 years. Climate, space, biotech, AI quantum, and then the potential of universal connectivity paired with its dark side, the potential for universal surveillance. The irony, of course, among systems thinkers is intellectually we know that all of these things are happening and are connected to each other, but when we get to work on them, we tend to break them, we put our engineer hat on and we break them into parts and we forget. So I urge you when you plan your strategies to ask yourself, how am I harnessing the synergies between these things that are happening anyway? How am I putting them to best use? One way, Back to our thought experiment for a second. How to look at climate as a major opportunity, both economically and politically. One framework is to think about dual innovation portals. And no surprise to the people who know me and read the name of the talk, I advocate looking very hard at climate and space. Why space? Well, it's still a relatively small industry. Despite all the hype, it's still a very small business. The barriers to entry have never been lower, and space affects everyone, everywhere. Why Guatemala and space? Space has the potential to capture the imagination of your young workforce. And if it does that successfully, the STEM training that comes with space will have untold benefits for your country. And last but not least, it's way past time for nations that are outside of the G7 or even the G20, the nations and indigenous people, to have a seat at the global and near space policy table. So how do you get started? Well, you start like any business. You look at where the funding and the demand is. Most of you have heard about Earth observation data, otherwise known as geospatial, and it is absolutely a huge part of the space economy and of the climate tech sector. But what about everything else? I like to think of climate invention and innovation in roughly three big buckets. Curing and reversing, as in, can we cool the planet? Coping and remediating, as in, how are we going to get through the coming decades and maybe centuries of extreme weather and water shortages? And outsourcing and relocating, the stuff of science fiction, but maybe coming sooner than you think. The idea of taking harmful or high heat-producing practices on Earth and moving them off planet. Let's take a little closer look. Here's some examples of verticals in these categories. Every one of these technologies and advances represent markets that have an application in both climate and in space. I urge you to think creatively and holistically in addressing terrestrial issues and think about how that also can form a sustainable space future. It's time for legacy, for sure. It's also time to think multi-generationally. And maybe for the very first time, to think as a species. So, what's Guatemala's place in this story? What will Guatemala do in space? Well, you start like every business, location, location, location. Guatemala, let's start with Guatemala's advantages. Near the equator, incredibly beautiful, rich soil, a common language with at least 20 other countries, a language and cultural ties and partnerships that can be accelerated. And yes, the golden ticket, a young population. With the space frontier looming and feeling real, and the private sector finally making monetizing near space even a possibility, space has recaptured the world's imagination. It's the perfect time to invest in technologies that also help scale climate action. It's a win-win. Investment in climate tech is at an all-time high. This particular slide does not reflect the most recent science and climate bills that passed in the United States. So these numbers will be even higher. This is happening all over the world. That's the good news. And it's happening in every sector. This is a World Economic Forum slide in their Strategic Intelligence Division. I apologize if it's hard to read, but it gives a wonderful linkage map of how climate, not just as a business, but climate action writ large, is associated with every sector of society and your economy. I find it interesting, though, that even the World Economic Forum only shows space connected to climate in its Earth observation mode, which is too bad. There's a huge amount of open source and open source data, open hardware, open everything. There's things way beyond your borders that can help you accelerate. There's companies like a friend of ours, Hyperganic, that has technology that's just blowing me away, to using AI-supported engineering to design products or design equipment that's free to use. You can download it and prototype and work with it, and that's an incredible leap ahead. You have the opportunity, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can start on third base. It's pretty incredible. If your government is not moving fast enough for you, well then innovate in your company, amongst your colleagues. Don't wait for anybody. It's time for radical new thinking on climate change. And frankly, it's time for planetary wide design thinking. It's also time to ask ourselves hard questions about space, about why we're going and what we really want that to look like. The future is interdisciplinary. Social sciences simply must come up to par with engineering. In fact, one of the greatest actions you can take as a country is to start supporting interdisciplinary degrees. After all, engineering is incredible for analytical thinking. But somewhere along the way in this century, maybe in the computer age where we have highly prized engineering, we've lost the ability for critical thinking. To solve the world's biggest challenges, we need the combination of the two. Climate and space have very different pain points, and they have different exits and monetizing horizons. Yet they have this massive swath of synergies. Those communities in the synergies are not currently communicating very well. Could Guatemala pioneer the process of space and climate tech having better communion? Maybe. Why not? You can't sleepwalk into space. So how do we get the next 30 years right? What can your nation or your region do? How can you support our shared future? How does it serve your needs to pursue these strategies? It's time to form strategic partnerships and to invest accordingly. How do we do more than survive? How do we thrive? Climate change isn't someday, and space isn't someday. They're both right now. The real question is, are we passengers or are we pilots? Thank you.